So, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear colleagues, dear guests, so it's my particular pleasure to welcome you to the OeNB panel discussion around the topic Wealth Inequality and Housing Booms. Are the young missing out? It is announced as in German, a Kamingespräch, so a fireside chat. I don't know whether this translation is appropriate, but unfortunately without a fireside, but with two very prominent participants. So Professor Stefania Albanesi from the University of Pittsburgh and the governor of the Austrian Central Bank, Österreichische Nationalbank, Professor Ewald Nowotny. So this panel discussion is part of the OeNB Guest Professorship Program, which has been introduced in 2015 in the context of the 650th anniversary of the University of Vienna and the 200th anniversary of the Austrian National Bank, the OeNB. It is fully funded through the OeNB and then allows us at the university to nominate once per year a leading scholar in the area of monetary economics, fiscal policy, and financial economics to serve as an OeNB guest professor. So serving as a guest professor means to come to Vienna at least 2 times, giving a public lecture, teaching a course for doctoral students, and participating in a public panel discussion around a fireside. And this event takes place today. So as the Dean of the Faculty of Business, Economics and Statistics, I'm very proud of having Professor Stefania Albanesi as the OeNB Guest Professor 2018. Professor Albanesi is Professor of Economics at the University of Pittsburgh. She's a research associate at the prestigious National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, and research fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR. Professor Albanesi's research is in macroeconomics, labor economics, and public economics, and is published in the leading journals all over the place. So Stefania visited us already in June. She gave an exciting public lecture and is now back in Vienna for her second visit. So welcome, Stefania. We are very happy of having you here again. It is also my particular pleasure to welcome Professor Ewald Novotny. Professor Nowotny earned a doctoral degree in law at the University of Vienna and a habilitation in economics at the University of Linz. After research visits and temporary position at the Technical University Darmstadt and Harvard University, he was appointed as a full professor at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. From 2003 to 2005, he has been vice-rector of the WU. Parallel to his career as a productive researcher and scholar, he also had a career in financial industry and politics. He served, among others, in the board of directors of the European Investment Bank, served as the chief executive of BAWAG, and in supervisory boards of different companies, including Dexia, Voestalpine, and the Austrian National Bank. Moreover, he held functions in the Austrian Social Democratic Party and has been member of the National Council. Since 2008, he is the governor of the Austrian National Bank and member of the European Central Bank's Governing Council. He actively and visibly, we all know him very well, contributes to ECB policy and discussions around monetary economics. He is the perfect example for a person bridging academia, practice, and politics. He keeps active contact to academia, supports research, brings in insights from academia into political discussions, and vice versa. In this context, it is also my particular pleasure to welcome Max Kothbauer, former vice president of the OeNB, former chairman of the university board, and current president of the Alumni Association of the University of Vienna. Max Kothbauer has been the initiator of the OeNB Guest Professorship Program. Thanks to him, and supported by Governor Nowotny, the program has been implemented in 2016. It has been originally planned until 2020. And we are particularly happy, however, that it just this year has been extended for 5 additional years until 2025. So thank you very much for that. This is a great initiative which gives us, the university and the OeNB, a lot of visibility in academia. It allows us to invite and to host world-class scholars in monetary economics and fiscal policy. It is probably unique to the program, or for the program, that it involves a fireside chat where the governor of the central bank personally acts as the leading dialogue partner and moderator. I'm pretty sure that there are not many governors around the world who do that. So, Professor Nowotny and Professor Albanesi, thank you very much for coming, for being here, and we look forward to your dialogue around wealth inequality and housing booms. Are the young missing out? Thank you very much for coming. So now I hand over to Professor Nowotny as the moderator of this panel discussion. Thank you very much.
So yeah. So dear Dean Hausch, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and of course dear Professor Albanesi, thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here again. I have to say, because you said that there will be few governors taking part in such a discussion. I'm not so sure about it. If we look at the Governing Council of the European Central Bank, more than 50% of the governors have a background as professors of economics. So, which is also one of the reasons why I enjoy so much to be at this group. So we do have, and I think this is, and of course you know you had in the US very prominent examples with Ben Bernanke. So there is a very close relationship between central banks and university research, and I'm very glad that we as Austrian Central Bank can contribute to this in Austria by creating this special chair. And again, I also want to thank Max Kotbauer very much for having the initiative. And I may tell you that at the Austrian Central Bank, you have an extremely effective lobbyist with Max being here with us. So today we have, I think, a very interesting topic and a very extremely interesting speaker. And without much further ado, I would invite you to give some presentation to this topic. Then I, from my side, will try to give some of the insights from the Austrian side, and then we may open up discussion. Please. Okay.
Well, first of all, I would like to begin by thanking the Austrian National Bank and the University of Vienna for the hospitality. It's been a really great experience to be here in this 4 weeks total. And I do have to say that in the United States, the Federal Reserve System and the various Feds, certainly invite academics to, contribute to their research and policy, policy-making activities. They certainly do not subsidize or encourage, programs in which academics visit universities, and there isn't much interaction, especially at the governor level. So it's particularly nice to see this going on here. So in addition to that, I wanted to give you a little bit of background why I chose this particular topic, sort of investment activity, the housing market, and the implications for wealth inequality and the young specifically. So in my public lecture in June, I presented some of my research that has to do with, essentially, who defaulted during the housing and mortgage crisis in the United States in 2007-2009. And, that research led us to some surprising results that really put real estate investors sort of at the core, of the phenomenon. And really, led us, myself and my co-authors, to revisit to some degree the narrative about both the housing boom and the housing crisis, and then sort of the longer-term implications for housing markets, but also for monetary policy and wealth inequality. And I think the sort of well-accepted narrative about the housing boom and about the housing crisis was that during the 2000 boom, credit, particularly mortgage credit, was extended to relatively low income, high probability of default borrowers, also referred to as subprime borrowers, who got these mortgages that they probably couldn't afford, and so eventually they defaulted, and so the policy prescription for that is just don't lend to low-income households with high probability of default, and then you will avoid the crisis and all the resulting consequences that we are to some degree still living with. So the narrative that we came away with by revisiting the data with essentially a better, more granular data set was actually that we did not see an increase in mortgages made to people with relatively low income who happen to be young in most cases. But we did see, two waves of increase in mortgages being made. So a first wave, which was not troubling at all between 2001 and about 2004, in which existing mortgage holders were able to refinance their mortgage, taking advantage of lower interest rates, that were essentially a response of the 2001 recession and, the sort of increased geopolitical risk associated with 9/11 and a bunch of different factors. But then between 2004 and 2007, we saw a big increase in so-called investor activities. So specifically these borrowers who held multiple mortgages. And of course, at least, if they have n mortgages, n-1 have to be for properties in which they don't reside. And so we refer to these people as investors. And so the rise, investors, at the peak of the housing boom accounted for only about 18% of all mortgages, but they accounted for over 40% of mortgage balances just because having multiple mortgages, they hold a lot of mortgage debt. And we found that essentially during the housing crisis, most of the growth in defaults, so the so-called foreclosure crisis, can really be attributed to these borrowers. So if households with just one mortgage, the regular types of households that we think of, that buy a home to live in there and need a mortgage in order to be able to afford that home, so the defaults on part of these borrowers went up very little. And instead, the big rise in default that led to the foreclosure crisis and therefore then the MBS crisis and so on, was driven by these investors. And so these investors, investor activity, it was also very concentrated in specific geographical market, particularly large urban areas that, since the late 90s have become increasingly attractive. And, and those urban areas were also the areas that experienced the biggest sort of swing in housing prices, sort of both the rise during the boom in the late 2000s and then the big crash of housing valuation during the housing crisis itself. Now, of course, if you're holding a home in an area with a lot of investors, even if you're not an investor, your net worth and your household wealth is going to be swinging, with real estate valuation in your areas that may be driven particularly by investor activity. But it seems that at least in the United States, areas where there is a high incidence of investor activities, which are mainly in urban areas, really experience more volatility of mortgage and housing markets, with potentially the stabilizing effects in other areas of the economy, going from household balance sheet to affordability crisis for young professionals that enter those areas and so on and so forth. So why do I think that this is important going forward? So since the late 90s, a phenomenon, basically technological transformation, and there is quite a bit of literature on this in economic geography and also trade, has sort of pointed to the fact that the type of technological innovations that we observe both at the occupation level and at the industry level, sort of the growth in top professional occupation, automation, and the growth in the service sector, have caused basically an increase in the concentration of basically job and population in these urban centers where top occupation occupations and top firms working in this, that are active in these growing industries find economies of so-called agglomeration. So it's, they're more productive if they're located in areas, where there are other firms, in those sectors. And this economies of agglomeration seem to be growing and are particularly prevalent in the industries and occupations that are now sort of, leading growth in most advanced economies. So what has happened in these areas is that this has really caused an affordability problem at the level of the housing market, not just, for relatively low income unskilled households, but especially for young professionals who, basically take these, professional jobs in these areas and then are not able to afford housing. So in addition to possible, more speculative forces leading investor activity, so these, sort of very slow-moving economic trends are also pointing us in a direction where, most people are going to live, in economic areas where housing has become unaffordable, and therefore you really need a rental market, so you need some kind of investment activity, either at the retail level, so just wealthy people buying multiple properties and then possibly renting them out, or, in the US, we also have a large institutional market for investors where developers just build buildings in order to rent them out in units. And I live in one such building, and so this is also very common, not so common outside the United States. So in the United States, with the growth of this investor type activity, which is driven by structural forces as well as maybe changes in monetary policy that affects interest rate spreads and so on, the question is, what direction is this taking the housing market, and what kind of potential instability does this generate for household balance sheets as more and more households are going to be concentrated in those areas, both households that are able to own a home as well as households who are not able to own a home, which are, essentially not going to benefit from potentially the house price appreciation that's coming from the structural forces that do actually generate a positive trend in housing valuation that's driven by fundamental values in those areas. And so this is, has a bunch of different possible, implications at the policy level and at the societal level. In the US, it's well known that sort of being able to own your own home is really a stepping stone for rising up the wealth distribution. And, sort of historically, one reason why, for example, African-American households in the United States have much lower wealth levels than white households is that they were essentially excluded, from housing markets. And it looks like now, though the division is not so much on racial lines, but we're going to have increasingly large sections of the population, not necessarily poor, who are going to be excluded from housing markets for these forces if this trend continues. Of course, the trend, if we think that it's not a positive trend, we could always try to intervene there. But so then it raises real questions about, the possible implications for exacerbating the growth in wealth inequality, which is already, much larger than the growth in income inequality, and the kinds of pressures that, poses at a political level, at a sort of societal level, and so on. And also, what I would really like to discuss with Governor Nowotny as well is sort of the implications for monetary policy. So I was at the Fed during the last, I was sort of researcher in the research department at the Fed in the last 2 waves of quantitative easing in the United States. And I can tell you internally that, one of the main goals of quantitative easing was to try and sort of get the mortgage market growing again. Because after the housing crisis, pretty much mortgage credit had dried up for everybody except borrowers with really, really high credit scores, who tended to be high income, already homeowners, and so on. And what happened is that partly based on the perception that the housing crisis was driven by borrowers with low income, essentially first-time home buyers, the young, and households, sort of average households were not able to get mortgages, but wealthy households with multiple properties were able to refinance mortgages and get new mortgages at very, very convenient rates. So these very prolonged periods of low interest rates that we had, first before the crisis in the 2000s and then after the crisis, has really affected and exacerbated, if you want, the adverse distributional effects, of this growth in investor activity. And so the question is, should monetary policy be concerned about that? And even if it's not concerned, how should we think about monetary policy in a context where it affects, households at such a deep level, by affecting mortgage terms and, who and how is able to get mortgages. So this is sort of, the point of departure of the discussion. And in the US, people are very afraid that we're going to go to a model in which, most people cannot own a home. So right now, the home ownership rate in the United States, it depends a little bit on how you measure it, but it's definitely above 55%, so 55 to 62, 63%. And so, policy in the United States since the early 30s has been really driven by the idea that owning your own home is the greatest thing that could happen to you. And there's a variety of different government policies to try and, essentially subsidize home ownership or make it easier. A lot of these policies end up being regressive. For example, the mortgage interest reductions. But, this is sort of seen as a sort of a key policy goal, and this now seems very elusive for policymakers in the United States. And so people are asking themselves, how do we reverse this? Should we reverse this? And so on. Now, in Europe, Germany, but also Austria, I learned, there is a model in which, most people don't own a home, and there's a large rental market with, a large, a set of investors, which are mostly retail investors, and that model is stable. You don't have a lot of house price volatility, and that could be a system that also works if we are in a position where, home ownership, becomes unattainable for, a large swath of the population. So this transition, though, between models, or in the current institutional setup in the United States, this growth in investor activity driven by lack of affordability, which seems to sustain itself, could have very destabilizing effects. And so I think it's sort of a useful thing to think about, because I don't think it's just driven by cyclical fluctuations in housing market. There is this fundamental force, which is exactly, the growth in economies of agglomeration, which really pushes urbanization and concentration of jobs, in particular, types of urban areas, which are the only areas that de facto are growing in terms of population and incomes and so on these days.
So thank you for this very rich and very concentrated view. Perhaps if I just may add some remarks. First, perhaps from the point of view of a central bank. Because for central banks, the housing market is extremely important. This is the biggest loan market that we have for banks. It is a market that can always create crisis. So many of these crises, as the housing crisis or the big crisis in the US, started from the real estate market. And therefore, the first thing is to observe it, which is not so easy because real estate markets are no homogeneous markets. So there are many different types, as you just explained. We at the Austrian Central Bank, we have started a special working group on housing markets, or real estate markets. And the first point is really to get to the data. So what we are trying to get really to have, let's say, reliable data on price developments in these markets, which is, I think, where we have, and we are now producing this data, and so I think this is we have some evidence for evidence-based politics. From the banking side, of course, one has to be aware that. Real estate markets and housing markets are always very special because these are long-term investments. And this always had been traditionally a challenge to finance. Historically, in the 19th century, it was seen as something of public regulation to finance this by heavily regulated long-term instruments in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, what is called Pfandbrief, which is an asset-backed security, which, by the way, in all these crises has proved to be a very stable instrument of financing because it still is heavily regulated. But this, of course, if there is a big demand for financing, is not enough. So typically we have this situation that these are long-term investments that are refinanced short-term. And that obviously is always an element that is prone to crisis. And therefore also this is, because of this, it is a market where in times of crisis central banks have to intervene. And as you said, in the US there was a very direct intervention by central banks on real estate markets. And of course it has two sides. On the one hand, intervening on the real estate markets. So, for instance, in the Fed, they bought directly mortgages, or they bought mortgages indirectly by guaranteeing with the agencies, with Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac. So this is where you have volume, because if you want to have an effect, you need volume, and where you have a very direct link between financing and, let's say, increase in production. So therefore, if you want to have an expansionary monetary policy that is effective rather fast, housing and real estate markets are the markets where you have to intervene. And in fact, it was successful. So the Fed spectacularly was successful in restoring the mortgage market, and also in Europe and also in Austria, we have been quite successful in restoring these markets. So, because it's about distribution, that means it had a positive effect on income distribution, because it reduced unemployment, it created new income. So the income distribution effect was positive. The wealth distribution effect, and this is what you alluded to, of course, was negative, because it meant that, of course, real estate prices were increasing because of cheap money, and therefore increased demand for real estate. So, but this is a dilemma central banks always have to face, that with monetary policy alone, you cannot have a variety of goals. If you want to have an expansion monetary policy, it means that you want to expand monetary activity. If it has side effects with regard to in distribution of wealth, then you have to use additional instruments like taxation or something like this. So I think this is the one side. The whole problems are very different from country to country, and I just want to not to be too long. I just want to give you some data with regard to the distribution in Europe. So a rather relatively homogeneous group, but where we have quite big difference, and these differences are caused by differences in social systems. If you have no functioning system no functioning pension system of adequate pensions, the only way to have a certain amount of security in old age is to live in your own house, in your own apartment. If you do have a functioning pension system, there is no need to provide for this. So therefore, we typically have also, and therefore I think it's important not to see the real estate market and the housing market in isolation. You have to see this in general. So just to give you some numbers, for instance, in Spain, the share of private households that are homeowners is 78%. And in Italy, it's about the same. In Austria, this share is 55%, but these 55%, of course, include those who live in apartments, owned apartments by non-profit housing associations. Eigentumswohnungen. So, but that are subsidized in some way with tax subsidies, so not privately, just market-based, but these kind of housing associations. On the other hand, the share of social housing in Austria is 23% of persons living in social housing. In the US, I think it's very low. So if for instance in Italy, I have here Italy, it's 5%. So you see again, there are two different worlds. This aspect and that home ownership is relatively limited in Austria also means that 66% of private households in Austria have no debts, which is of course extremely different, let's say, to the US, where households are loaded up with debts. Which also means that there is a higher stability in some way, because if you just look now at those who have what kind of debts we have of course fewer mortgage holders in Austria, 18.4% compared to Euro area 23%. So I don't want to get into more details. I think you see there are quite differences, and these differences are of course quite striking also in the public discussion, because we have had statistics of private wealth for the Euro area, and in this statistics of private wealth, Italy was on the top of it, Germany and Austria pretty down. The reason is because home ownership, which, by the way, brought some experts of the Deutsche Bundesbank, the German central bank, in a recent articles, they proposed, they said, well, if Italy has a problem, what is the problem? They have so much private wealth, let's tax private wealth in Italy. So you see, which was not very well taken by the Italian government, this idea. But so you see, it is something that is of enormous economic, social, and political importance. But it is something where different countries have different solutions. And basically, I would, if I understood well what you were kind of explaining, I think that this, let's say, Austro-German, Swiss model, Swiss is perhaps Swiss. Home ownership in Switzerland is much higher. Let's say Austro-German model is some that is basically, I think, rather well functioning. It rests, of course, on kind of a number of social and legal institutions. And last point, of course, housing markets, like every market, have are confronted with demand and supply side. And in a situation of heavy, strongly increasing demand, because, as you said, for instance, in central cities, where there is huge migration into these cities, it's quite obvious that we will get problems in the housing market. And then there are very different ways how to solve this. And those of you who read German newspapers will see that there's a very big debate range in Germany how to cope with that. In the German newspaper Die Zeit, a very leading newspaper, that was just this weekend, also last weekend, let's say very libertarian economist who said, yes, so housing prices in the inner city are so high, or in the towns, that poor people cannot afford it to live there. So what? They should live outside. So this is a bit the Marie Antoinette approach. So if they can't afford it, just take something else. This is not the approach that we take in Austria, also not the approach that is, as far as I see, with the present German government. But it means that then you have to have some increase in social housing, which is, of course, takes time. So this is not something that the time lags about it. That you have to discuss the regulation of land use, because it is also the price of land and the availability of land. So then you need a whole spectrum of instruments. So I think it is, therefore I think the housing market is one of the most interesting markets, first for researchers, but of course also for those who want to live there. So that is, perhaps if you want to add something.
I mean, this is, sort of a very interesting perspective. I wanted to point out a couple of things. So one thing about data. So it's great that there is a data collection effort, because certainly in the United States, we do not have good data on housing. So there is no good data set where we actually see a lot of information on the properties themselves, good information on the borrowers, good information on the financing. We either see one of the sides of, of this puzzle, but never the three at the same time. And that's really, important to understand what's really going on. So part of the perspective that, subprime borrowers really led the boom and the crisis was that, people were looking at subprime debt as, mortgages that were not conforming, i.e. not your standard, Fannie Freddie type mortgages. So it turns out that non-conforming mortgages are the kind of mortgages that you use for investment properties, not necessarily because the borrower has a low credit score. So that's, just knowing, having better data is pretty crucial to understand what is happening. And I think that's a limitation. But just in general, on this investor type activity, so what's really interesting to me, partly because I live in the United States, I am originally from Milan and I travel a lot. And I've lived in New York City for a long time, and now I live in Pittsburgh, which is sort of a growing, exploding city. So this phenomenon, though the mortgage and housing markets vary very markedly across countries, what is happening in urban areas where, college graduates and maybe PhD graduates and master graduates want to go and live, because that's where the jobs are, frankly, is very similar across countries. So I see Milan, I see New York. Obviously, New York is not Milan, but some of the same phenomena are going on. And Frankfurt is very similar, Barcelona. So though, there's very different institutional structures behind the housing market in different countries, and also institutional structures around the mortgage markets, cities seem to behave very similarly, which is sort of what makes this interesting, because, you have the same sort of structural phenomenon, geographical agglomeration and so on, but happening in different contexts. Can we learn from that? And but this does seem that, these large urban successful areas, the so-called superstar cities, seem to have a dynamic of their own, which seem to be a little bit disconnected from the underlying institutional structure. And I think one of the reasons why they are disconnected is that you do have these investors which sort of operate sort of on a slightly different basis, because some of them, especially the larger ones, may get the financing in, in different ways than your regular, household that gets a mortgage. So that's, one thing to keep in mind here, that we have a similar phenomenon happening in very different institutional structures. But, one thing that I think is really appealing about the German housing model is that, so I was actually recently at Goethe University, so I was talking to a bunch of people there about this, including people who do research on this stuff. So they were pointing out that the trifecta of this model is having a really good provision of high quality social housing, and then having not much, tax incentives to own homes, which obviously reduces the home ownership rate, but also means that if you are somebody who owns multiple homes, at least you don't get a tax benefit from doing so. And so that sort of, reduces the degree to which, that becomes, exacerbating of wealth inequality. And the other big thing in the German system, which also applies to the Italian system, is very high transaction taxes. So you don't have a lot of flipping. So in the United States, what really drives the fact that investors are really responsible for the booms and busts in housing valuations is that, transaction costs are quite low for, being active on the housing market, and also for closing your mortgages, refinancing them, and so on. So you have these cascades, that can can happen. In the German system, we usually, as economists, we don't like any friction, including transaction taxes and so on. But, you know, for a market that is sensitive, you know, at the household level or at the depository level, it may be beneficial not to have this market, you know, be swinging wildly, you know, across extremes. And obviously, transaction taxes are a way to do that. So that is, you know, a way where the German market, you know, successfully deals, you know, with these pressures, and maybe it's going to deal with these pressures going very well in the future, even if, you know, certainly in some areas, especially Frankfurt and Munich, you know, there are really tight pressures on the housing market, but this doesn't have seemed to bubbled over. Now, with respect to, you know, being Marie Antoinette and say, okay, well, if low-income households, you know, cannot afford to live in cities, let them live in the suburbs. So this is a big problem, for example, in New York City and San Francisco, where, you know, what is happening at the structural level is job polarization. So you have growth in top occupations, but you also have growth in the bottom occupations that provide these low-level services that, you know, professionals, you know, need. And so if these people, you know, cannot live in cities, there's going to be a real problem of mismatch. You know, you need services, and the people who can provide those services just cannot live where you need the services. So that's a real issue. And this is just for low-level services, but also for teachers. You know, in New York City, a big problem is that, you know, teachers cannot afford to live in the city. So it's a real problem to staff, you know, not just the public schools that, you know, pay the teachers not so well, but even, you know, elite private schools which pay the teachers better, but they pay them as teachers, not as investment bankers. And so the teachers, you know, cannot afford to live in a commuting distance. So the issue, you know, when I completely agree that when you think about the housing market, you need to think about all aspects of the housing market, not just the top end or the bottom end, because they are all obviously intimately connected. And I think, you know, at least my understanding of the debate in the media and maybe even in policy circles is that the discussion is very disconnected, so that, you know, the different segments of the market are seen in isolation. And, you know, so the growth, say, of housing valuations at the very top is seen as one phenomenon and is seen as disconnected from these, you know, structural changes that are happening at a lower frequency. And policymakers, certainly not central bankers, but I think more fiscal policymakers and politicians are really not yet well informed, you know, about, or maybe they just don't want to hear about, you know, the various interactions between these aspects. So I think there's a real effort to be made, I think, to educate, you know, policymakers and the public about the fact that these are all linked phenomenon and require an integrated approach. But when I think about this, if I think about the class of people who are potentially most hit by this, I think about young, so people who just graduated and are their first job experiences, because literally you cannot get a professional job outside of a large city these days. It's just very, very hard. So you're going to need to, you know, live in one of these cities, and then the question is, you know, how can you afford to live there, and how does it affect long term, not just, you know, your ability, you're having a long commute or spending most of your income on rent, but also, you know, household formation, fertility rates, you know, what are the long-run implications of these kinds of, you know, pressures, which of course, you know, matter in the future for a whole you know, host of issues. So one thing that is happening in Europe, you know, already fertility rates are very low, which is causing problems in terms of financing social security system and generating tax revenues. If on this, you know, premise we add, you know, further pressure reducing household formation and maybe fertility rates coming from the fact that, you know, you can't find a suitable place to live where you can work, you know, that's going to be another very long-term, you know, phenomenon that's going to be affecting, you know, this area. So it just seems really important to think about it.
So, as you just have heard, many of you may be affected by this topic. So now I think there is a chance for discussion. May I invite who wants to put a question or some comments? So now, please, yeah. Yeah.
The name is Gernandt. I come from the credit business, but it was more related to North Sea oil projects and shipping projects than housing. Housing is a very basic need, of course, for people who live and work somewhere. And when we came to Vienna around the turn of the century, we bought an apartment with a price tag somewhat above average, I would suspect. But within weeks, we got, first of all, we had to obtain a permit as foreigners. My country was not in the EU, nor was Austria at that time. A permit to buy property in Vienna. And within weeks, we got an inquiry from the tax office how we were financing this purchase. We had to give very detailed information. And I have the impression that this control over the purchase of property, real estate by foreigners has been diluted catastrophically in Vienna. So you have all these luxury projects coming up with luxury apartments being sold to dubious Russian oligarchs, and so you wonder, where does this money come from? And no one is inquiring about it. And you have the same in London, of course. They are starting to worry about it a bit, I think. And in Germany you have it. Plus, in Germany, you have the mafia reinvesting their funds. I think, and this trend puts tremendous pressure on prices, and also pressure on construction resources, which are used to build these luxury houses instead of affordable housing for normal citizens of the country. And I think those are two things that really need to be looked at. The sale of real estate to foreigners and the sources of financing.
Yeah, I suppose for the Austrian side, you expect an answer from my side. First, I'm glad to hear what you said, that Austria has, or perhaps had, functioning institutional kind of guards. And I think it's the housing market needs a lot of regulation. So. Of course, what we see now, and not only in Austria but in many other countries, it's that we have it is a very inhomogeneous market. Of course, there has developed a luxury element of it, where from the financing side, of course, we as central banks, we insist very much on safeguards against money laundering and all these kind of things, which maybe are effective, perhaps in Austria, perhaps more effective than in London, where they take this a bit more leisurely. But this is one element. But this is, of course, not the full housing market. So we have, of course, still a very differentiated housing market. The problem is that this element of, let's say, affordable housing most probably needs to a certain extent some kind, again, of control. Either by zoning, so that you have certain regions where you say, this is something where there will be no speculative building. And this is exactly the approach that they just now try to take in Vienna. In Germany, there is a discussion about rent control. Rent control is always a bit of a difficult element if you do it in an isolated way, and it is too heavily. Then, of course, the problem is that old real estate might not be, might be neglected, and there is not enough new investment. If you do it in a cautious way, it might have an effect because it gives you time till you can build up new supply. So I think this is, well, and by the way, because I recently, you see, we are making inquiries about the Viennese housing market. So I was talking to one real estate agent serving one of the biggest one. What we see just now in Vienna is not Russian oligarchs buying up these very fancy apartments, but rich Austrians. Because what we see just now is that a number of very well-run Austrian companies are sold to foreign companies. And they get huge amounts of money if they sell this, hundreds of millions. And the typical approach of somebody who just got hundreds of millions is to buy a wonderful house at the Ringstrasse, is to buy a wonderful apartment. And so just today, these big investments are usually Austrian individuals who bought their company. But this is something very specific.
Well, so I think you make a very, very valid point. And so in the United States and Canada, the cities that have a lot of international investor activity, Russian oligarchs, Chinese plutocrats, the lot, would be New York, Miami, LA, San Francisco, and then Vancouver and Toronto. And you do see investor activity that's completely unlinked from international investors. For example, Phoenix, Arizona, Denver, Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, to some degree, Nashville, Tennessee. So these are areas that receive completely domestic investor activities, exactly trying to, capture this market of, young professionals. And so these international investors that come in with LLCs and it's not clear who is buying the property. So at some level, from a mortgage market and a systemic risk perspective, these people buy cash, so they don't, enter that market. But it is the case that though it's a very segmented side of the market, I know the New York City market quite well, they do affect, prices at a broad spectrum, and they do affect incentives of developers in terms of, if there is an area that is rezoned, what do? Do you, build a rental building that is for 25-year-old, young professionals, or do you build, a condo building where apartments, sell for 90 million and are always empty? And so I think, this is a real question of, the kinds of, even if that housing market specifically is segmented, it is going to have sort of a downstreaming impact on housing valuation more broadly. But, investors that are not international investors, that are more driven by, sort of local housing needs and just, growing cities such as Pittsburgh, Denver, Phoenix, and so on, are still having an effect on housing markets, and so you see that dynamic even where there are no international investors. But I think the issue of international investors is a very big one, and it's also connected to this massive growth of inequality at the very top, and you just need to find some asset where you can store value, and so the apartment in Vienna, London, or New York might be a good way to go.
In Austria, there is one hotspot of this, and this is Kitzbühel. This is exactly the place where it is a little problem for the local population. So just to find adequate housing, and therefore, again, in Kitzbühel, they had the solution of zoning. There are certain areas where no foreign investors are allowed, which is not so easy, according to if these are, for instance, German investors, so an EU country in Austria. And so therefore we have always lawsuits in Kitzbühel about exactly this point. But I think this is exactly something where if you just allow markets to work, the local population is driven out. Any further? Please, 1, 2.
Thank you. My name is Hernan, and I'm a student of economics. Maybe if I could just try to pin down or nail down the discussion a little bit. What would you say would be, especially for the Austrian case, the two most important or significant policies to address these two issues of wealth inequality and housing boom?
Do you want?
Oh, for Austria, probably the expert is the governor. So I can tell you what is not happening in the United States, and I think could happen. It's probably more likely to happen in a European setting, just because people have more of a taste for government intervention than in the United States. So one of the big crises, which is driven by this growth of housing valuations at the top is that, as I was just saying, in relation to international investors, it really affects developer incentives in terms of the kinds of property that they want to develop. And so if you leave this to just developer incentives, you're going to get a bunch of construction that is really high end. So having either a better provision of higher quality subsidized social housing, or just subsidizing affordable housing, could be a way to go. With the caveat, though, and I think this might work quite well in Europe. In the United States, this has not been affected because in the following sense. So there are a lot of programs for subsidized affordable housing, but essentially developers, they get tax abatements and other tax discounts in order to build subsidized affordable housing in addition to regular housing that they would have been built anyway. But in order for them to participate, so the developers pretty much have the bargaining power in the United States. So they, for a low number of affordable housing units, they get large discounts, and still most of the housing that is built is sort of the high-end housing. So the question is, so in the US there's an issue of just political influence of different types of elements in the population, but sort of having a serious programs along these lines, would be really effective. And in the U.S. this is not working, and I think maybe in Europe it can work better, or maybe it already exists. So my understanding is in the German system, there is already very good social housing programs. So these housing pressures at the top, are not as disruptive, for the rest of the population. They're more, localized to the young professionals who need to move to Frankfurt. But, if you're a teacher or a lower income, household, you're not necessarily hit by that already. So that is one thing that, I would, that comes to mind just in comparison with the United States. I don't know if the government wants to add anything.
Well, to try to give of course, the first is a strong role for social housing. But in this case, I think it's also important to be aware what you have to avoid is creating ghettos, yes, like they have in the US, like they have in. So it has to be distributed on many locations in the town. So don't concentrate it. The second aspect is to have a strong role of this low profit housing associations, and this was a big mistake that many municipalities made in Germany, where they privatized the housing associations. This is one of the reasons why obviously there is this crisis in Germany now, in many countries, and where now municipalities are trying to buy back some of this. But of course, many of these have been bought up by institutional investors, many of them American investors, and so that a very important instrument of influencing the housing market has been lost. Because and so therefore, just in Vienna, of course, there are also some attempts by some investors to get hold of these housing associations. So it's very important to keep them in their no-profit situation. Yeah.
Paul Pichler, Department of Economics. So. I have a question to both of you, and I would be curious to hear whether you share the same opinion on this issue. You mentioned before that the low interest rate environment has contributed to rising house prices, and rising house prices in turn have contributed to what you refer to the young missing out. On the other hand, so this might lead us to the conclusion that low interest rates contribute to the young missing out. On the other hand, we do know that without low interest rates, probably the young wouldn't be able to afford a mortgage at all these days. So taking these effects, both of them into consideration, what would your conclusion be like? Did low interest rates environments turn out to be beneficial for the young generation, or the other way around?
You want me to start? Okay, so I completely agree with that point, and it's so in labor economics we have these insider and outsider models, right? So if you already are employed, you might have some protections, and if you're outside the system, you don't have access. It seems to me that the housing market has become, in the United States, is becoming a little bit like that because, and this is different in Europe. So in the United States, if you already own a mortgage and interest rates go down, you refinance it, and you can, benefit from that. It doesn't really solve the problem of a relatively young household that has to come up with the down payment. And so if housing valuations are very high, you need to come up with a 15 or 20% down payment. Even if the interest rate is low, your biggest obstacle is going to be the down payment. And that's, in the US system. So there are some programs, the Federal Housing Administration have these programs for first-time home buyers. But for example, right after the crisis, on this notion that too much credit was given to, borrowers with low credit scores during the boom, which was not, in fact, true. All those thresholds for credit scores were raised in order to qualify for a mortgage, and so the young completely missed out from the low interest rate environment. So it seems to me, so in a relatively low housing environment, so in the U.S. in areas where house prices have not grown a lot, so young people, don't have a big problem raising the down payment for their mortgage, and so then they take advantage of the low interest rates, that they can get on that mortgage. But in the areas where, essentially the biggest constraint is the down payment, it doesn't matter what the interest rate is, in any case you cannot, buy the home. And so this is really the tension, when you think about interest rates and their distributional effects. And low interest rates are good for the young in other ways. The young just borrow a lot because of life cycle considerations. So if interest rates are low, it makes it cheaper for them, to borrow, to buy a car, maybe they have some credit card debt, maybe they have student debt. So the young benefit from low interest rates in a variety of ways because they are the group of people that have the greatest need to borrow. But with respect to housing, there's this down payment, requirement, which is very hard, to meet if house prices are very high. So that, seems to be the intervention.
Just to follow up, and I tried to refer to this in my presentation. I think with the policy of low interest rates, you have to distinguish between the wealth effects, and the wealth effects have a kind of negative effect on wealth distribution, and the income effect. And the income effect is a positive effect on income distribution. So in that sense, I think you cannot have one without the other, which means that if you want to have an expansion in monetary policy, and then you have to have additional instruments that with regard to housing markets. There is another perhaps kind of dilemma that we are just now facing, also in Austria and in some other countries. This is what we have developed after the crisis, the whole set of what we call macro-prudential policy. So that means that we don't have to rely on interest rates alone for regulating markets, but that we have a number of other instruments too. And of course, real estate markets and housing markets are a main field of macroprudential policy. Which means, for instance, and this is something that we as Austrian Central Bank, together with the Financial Market Authority, have just done, that we recommend, we have not as a legal, it's not a legal provision, but it's a recommendation, for instance, a loan-to-value ratio of not more than 80%. So that means you have to have at least 20% of own equity for this. Which you could interpret this as having being a disadvantage to young first homeowners, because it's very difficult for them to get this. Or we have also banks have to observe a special relationship between costs of housing and permanent yearly income. But all this is, and I think one has to be very clear, interest rate policy as such cannot be a substitute for social policy. Interest rate policy is an element of macroeconomic stabilization. And if you want to achieve further social policy goals, which I think you should, then you need additional instruments, like, for instance, increasing social housing, like zoning and so on. And I think this is, and this, for instance, we had last week a meeting in Frankfurt where this was the General Council from all EU countries, where, for instance, our Swedish colleague, the governor of the Swedish Central Bank, said he's in a very difficult situation in his country because for stability aspects, they want to have to use their macroprudential instruments. That means elements that restrict giving loans for buying real estate. But of course, it has exactly the danger that it means that you make it much more difficult for first-time buyers, for the young, to get into this market. And so therefore, there might be a conflict of goals between financial stability on one side and social affordability on the other side. But here you have a kind of also division of labor. Central banks have to have we have our mandate is to follow stability. For social policy, we would need additional instruments. I think this is a very basic element. But did you want to intervene immediately to this? Perhaps if we give a chance to this immediately, and then.
Yes, there are these conflicting goals, but concerning this macroprudential policy, based on the results of Professor Albanesi, you might think of a little bit more complex rules. And how do you think about that? You could say, well, let's take down the loan-to-value ratio for first mortgages and put it up for higher mortgages. So that's a slightly more complex rule. I know it's more difficult to enforce, but it would be still simple enough, and it would actually achieve both goals. So you have basically two instruments. How would you think about it? And of course, would you think? How would you think about sort of macroprudential policy to actually try to address the issue that you raised?
This is, I may add, this is something, for instance, the Swiss authorities have done. So they have kind of a differentiated policy. Again, discussing with our Swiss colleagues, they are not fully convinced. The problem with macroprudential instruments is that they may work with very great time lags. And if there is kind of a bit of an element of speculation, like they have in Switzerland, these speculative movements may be so strong that they just overrun our macroprudential tools. So, but then, of course, then the question is, well, if this is not enough, then you really have to do something with interest rate.
No, but if I can speak to that, I think this is a very good point. So just going back to the issue of the young are a very identifiable group. So if you think, the young face this very specific, down payment constraint, and we know that the young face upward income trajectory, so you could just, reduce the down payment requirements for the young, and that would be one way to go. But there's another, aspect of macroprudential policy. So ultimately, the reason why most people default on a loan is that they cannot make the payment. So there's this debt services requirement, a debt servicing requirement, in addition to down payment requirements that can also be used. Speaking, specifically to investors. So during the housing boom in the United States in the 2000s, so rental rates were very low. So people who would mostly have gotten their income from rental payments from owning properties, their income would have not been all that high because, mainly they were holding the properties for thinking about the capital gains. But if you impose, the total mortgage payments have to be a certain, maximum fraction of people's income, that would have prevented, some of these investors from getting their third or fourth mortgage because, the debt servicing ratio would have been violated. So the UK system actually has a formula for debt servicing in addition to, the down payment requirement for every mortgage. And so if you don't meet that, you don't get the mortgage, even if if you have the down payment. The US has nothing. And Dodd-Frank, which is the law that was passed in 2010 to sort of, improve macroprudential as well as micro, management of, mortgage markets and financial markets, has a very, very loose provision that, mortgage lenders have to, take into account, a borrower's income, but there's nothing there. So using debt services requirements more effectively, I think, would really help, not put all the weight of macroprudential policy on down payments, which really, affects, the ability of first-time home buyers, to enter the market, and those are maybe the ones that we care about most,
I got signals that we should come to an end with this discussion. So I think there are two, one and two. So then we can. Mr. Würgötter, please.
I'm a retired economist. Now, in the title we have the young missing out, and one area where the young in Europe may be missing out, is the speed of the recovery after the crisis, which in the US and in Europe at the beginning was sort of similar, but then in the euro area we had this double dip of the euro crisis in the early 2010s. Now my simple question is, could this have anything to do with the housing market? Is there an aspect of the housing market that made the recovery from the crisis in the US more sustainable and in Europe less sustainable? Or should we maybe in Europe look also for a real estate developer as a president?
You should know the answer because Mr. Würgötter was economist with the OECD, so I think you should know the answer. So please.
So I think that's a really good point. And so the research that we have for the United States is that, for example, aggregate consumption is really sensitive to housing valuations. And it's true that in some areas, housing prices, remain depressed for a long time. But in many of the areas where you have most housing, housing recovered, and you can argue that that had wealth effects and, stimulated consumption demand, and that, had an indirect effects on labor demand in general. There could be, that kind of a mechanism there. But it's also true that, pretty much starting in the late 90s and then increasing in the 2000s and after the crisis, essentially young college graduates get lower quality jobs than they did, earlier on. And so there has been sort of this problem of, despite rising demand for these professional jobs that require college and advanced degrees, so this demand is very concentrated in certain fields and so on. So I think, even if the US didn't have a double dip, and if at some level, partly because of, QE and, very stimulative monetary policy, there was a very, a strong recovery, at least overall in the economy, not so much in the labor market. The labor market remained very depressed until 2013, 14, also in the United States. But there's still this tension, I think that young, people face in the United States, coming from relatively low wages for college graduates in most fields, except, very few, areas, and then, this pressure coming from, just affordability of housing.
That was the last question from third row, please.
Thank you. So my name is Lucas. I'm a student of economics. I have maybe one remark, because I think there's one important part we are still missing in this discussion. So if I recall, I think we have identified a problem in the housing market, namely that young people like me would have a problem, for instance, to find housing in, say, New York, or maybe also in Vienna, maybe less here, but in big cities in general. So suppose we would be able to solve that problem, doesn't matter how, but just suppose we would manage to get housing prices a bit down such that I could afford housing, for instance, in New York. Then I'm wondering what happens with those people who would have purchased those luxury apartments if we would not have gotten there. So in other words, those people who are currently buying these luxury apartments, which are in fact empty. I think we are still talking only about one single market, but we clearly need some systemic perspective to assess any policy we might want to discuss. Because clearly there's still money or capital or however you want to call it, which people want to invest somewhere, and hence any intervention does not only have an impact on this particular single market, but also on many other markets. And I think this is an important issue we always need to think of, and it's a bit difficult only to treat the housing market as some kind of isolated thing.
Perhaps so that you have done the last word. So first, I think it's as I think all of us said. Yes, the housing market is, of course, it's not a homogeneous market. From our point of view of the central bank, of course, the main point difference is how is housing financed. If it is financed by debt, and there is a housing crisis, it becomes a problem for the banks. And then it becomes a problem for the whole stability. If it is financed by equity, then it's only the problem of the guy who bought this apartment. Typically, luxury apartments are bought by equity. And as you said, sometimes you don't know where the cash may come from. But from a central bank point of view, if there is a housing crisis, they are losing in wealth, but no bank will be, at least not directly affected. So therefore, we as central banks, for us, one of the most important elements is the financing side, because this translates directly into the stability of the banking system. But in a wider range, again, we have seen housing markets don't always go up. They may have wide fluctuations. And these wide fluctuations may be of the prime causes for fluctuations of the whole economy. And therefore, I think from this point of view of, let's say, some social aspects for housing for the young, you always will need a regulated part of the market, because this is the stable element. So these flats that are in some of housing associations or so on, they have no market prices and they don't fluctuate. So therefore, I think this is the important element. If you want to have the social part of it, you need a regulated element. Then there might be a non-regulated. This may fluctuate quite widely, but if it is not that financed, this is not such a big problem, because it's a problem for the happy few who were able to buy this some time ago.
So if I can add to that, I completely agree about the financing in terms of systemic risk. But, you know, at least in the United States, and it's partly because, you know, the home ownership rate is relatively high, you know, fluctuation in housing values do affect, you know, consumption patterns, for example. So if you have, you know, a big boom in housing prices, you know, that's also going to increase in consumption. And contrary, if housing prices declines, that's going to decrease aggregate consumption. So there's this macro, you know, type implications. Of course, you know, if fewer people own their homes, this, you know, maybe effect will go away. So we need to, you know, worry less around that. But right now in the United States and in most countries where there's so home ownership rate is high, you know, aggregate economic conditions are going to depend on housing price fluctuations. And then the question, you know, when you think about these investors, you know, how much does this trickle down, you know, the pressure at the top coming from the Russian oligarchs or whoever, you know, to the other housing markets. In some, you know, US cities and also in Milan, for example, it does trickle down. Why? Because, you know, of the geographical configuration of the city. So if you're building, you know, luxury, you know, apartments for the Russian oligarchs, you know, you don't have space to build, you know, housing for young professionals. So that it kind of feeds down throughout, you know, the housing market. In certain areas, it's not like that, because you have space where you can build, you know, other housing. So what is happening, for example, in New York is that, you know, the city has all these programs to try and convince, you know, luxury developers not to build the condo, you know, for the Russian oligarch, but to build, you know, still luxury luxury housing for young professionals, luxury rental housing, but at least it's going to give, housing to young professionals as opposed to Russian oligarch. But, it's a very direct intervention that in the US, it's highly contested. Only very few cities, do this because it's seen very negatively just by public opinion. And it's just a culture, around the government intervention in markets. So it's, in Europe, I think this is much easier. There's more consensus around the need for this.
So I think I got some signals that I think we have had a very interesting discussion. I hope that for the students it serves as a kind of an incentive to get interested in a very important, interesting field of economics. That means looking at housing markets and their financing. Mr. Dean, I think you're now ending this meeting.
Okay, so now it's up to me to say, first of all, thank you to Governor Nowotny. Thank you to Professor Albanesi for a very inspiring discussion, for giving us a lot of insights into a very important topic. And let me express or acknowledge. So, okay, that's for Stefania. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Governor Nowotny, a small thing, so thank you very much
for
coming, for being here.
Thank you.
I hope this is agreeable with my compliance department. But
that's right.
So let me also thank the Austrian National Bank again for supporting this great program, for making this possible. Thank you for coming, for contributing to our discussion. And a final thing, I also would like to thank Dr. Kienast and so our faculty manager and his team, and for people supporting, making this possible for this perfect organization of this event. So, and I hope that we can continue discussions over some drinks and some food. So the last message for today is that the buffet is open. Thank you very much.